The 20th century began in 1901, and the first decade of the 1900s set the tone for what was to come. It was a mix of optimism through invention, but also rising political tensions that would eventually explode later on. One of the defining conflicts was the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905. Russia expected an easy win, but Japan stunned the world by defeating them both on land and at sea. It was the first time a non-European power had beaten a European empire in modern warfare. For Japan, it meant recognition as a major world power. For Russia, it was humiliating and destabilizing. The war fed directly into the 1905 Russian Revolution, when protesters demanding reform were gunned down by the Tsar's troops on what became known as Bloody Sunday. Strikes and uprisings spread, and Tsar Nicholas II was forced to set up the Duma, Russia's first parliament, though he kept most real power for himself. In Europe, alliances were forming. In 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, ending centuries of rivalry and aligning against Germany. By 1907, Russia had joined in, creating the Triple Entente. These agreements looked like diplomatic maneuvering at the time, but they hardened Europe into two armed camps, one side led by Germany and Austria-Hungary, the other by Britain, France, and Russia. Meanwhile, the United States was stepping onto the world stage. In 1903, America backed Panama's independence from Colombia, and in return, gained control of the Panama Canal project. Once completed, it would connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, a huge boost for both trade and military power. At home, President Theodore Roosevelt was cracking down on monopolies, pushing reforms and setting aside land for conservation. His policies showed the U.S. was entering a new era of influence. The decade also brought inventions that would reshape everyday life. In 1903, the Wright brothers made the first powered flight. In 1908, Henry Ford launched the Model T, the first affordable car, and pioneered the idea of mass production. Suddenly, flight and driving weren't just dreams. They were becoming part of reality. Science and culture were also shifting. Albert Einstein published his theory of special relativity in 1905, completely changing how we think about space and time. And artists like Pablo Picasso were breaking from tradition, moving towards modern styles like Cubism. And so, by the end of the 1900s, the world felt like it was racing forward. But underneath the progress, rivalries, revolutions, and alliances were pulling nations closer to a major war. The 1910s were dominated by one event above all others, the First World War. But the decade didn't begin with war. It began with the world still divided into empires, each competing for power. In 1912, tensions in the Balkans started boiling over. The Balkan Wars pushed the Ottoman Empire out of much of southeastern Europe and created a hotbed of nationalist rivalry. That instability reached a breaking point in June 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was assassinated in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia mobilized to defend Serbia. Germany backed Austria-Hungary, and within weeks, the world's strongest powers were dragged into the conflict. World War I lasted from 1914 to 1918 and reshaped the world. The fighting stretched from Europe to the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. New weapons like machine guns, poison gas, and tanks turned the war into a stalemate of trenches and unimaginable casualties. Battles like the Somme and Verdun left millions dead or wounded. By the time the war ended, an estimated 16 million people had been killed. The United States entered late in 1917, after repeated German submarine attacks on American ships and the discovery of the Zimmermann telegram, where Germany tried to convince Mexico to join the war against the U.S. America's arrival tipped the balance, and in November 1918, Germany agreed to an armistice. The war toppled empires. The Russian Revolution of 1917 forced Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate, and soon after, the Bolsheviks under Lenin seized power, beginning the world's first communist state. Germany's Kaiser was overthrown, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and Britain and France were left exhausted. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, officially ended the war with Germany. The treaty placed heavy blame and reparations on Germany, redrew borders across Europe and the Middle East, and created the League of Nations, the first attempt at a global peacekeeping body. But the harshness of Versailles left deep resentment in Germany, something that would explode again 2 decades later. Outside the war, the 1910s still had moments of progress. Women's suffrage movements gained momentum. Britain gave women over 30 the right to vote in 1918, while the US followed with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Technology also advanced. Radio was being developed, and mass production spread beyond cars to consumer goods. But ultimately, the decade is remembered for the war that shattered illusions of progress, rewrote borders, and left the world desperate to avoid another catastrophe. The 1920s were a decade of extremes. On one hand, the world was recovering from the First World War with optimism, new culture, and booming economies. On the other, the decade planted the seeds of future crises. In Europe, the post-war settlement created instability. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled Germany with reparations and territorial losses, fueling resentment. In Italy, dissatisfaction after the war helped Benito Mussolini rise to power. By 1922, he had marched on Rome and established the world's first fascist government. Across the Soviet Union, Lenin, and later Stalin, tightened communist rule after the 1917 revolution, suppressing opposition and restructuring the economy. In the United States, the 1920s became known as the Roaring Twenties. Industry boomed, consumer goods spread, and cities grew. The mass production of cars, led by Ford, changed how people lived. Radios brought news and entertainment into homes. Hollywood rose as the center of global cinema, while jazz exploded in popularity, symbolizing the new modern culture. But this came with contradictions. Prohibition, starting in 1920, banned alcohol nationwide, yet it fueled organized crime, speakeasies, and notorious gangsters like Al Capone. The decade also marked political change. In 1920, the League of Nations began its mission to maintain peace, though the US never joined, weakening its authority. In 1929, the world economy was shaken when the Wall Street crash triggered the Great Depression. What had seemed like a decade of unstoppable prosperity ended in collapse almost overnight. Globally, colonial tensions were growing. In India, Mahatma Gandhi led campaigns of nonviolent resistance against British rule. In China, the struggle between the nationalist Kuomintang and the communists under Mao Zedong was beginning to reshape the country. Japan, meanwhile, expanded its influence, signaling ambitions that would later lead to conflict. The 1920s were also a turning point for women. In many countries, women gained the vote and more visibility in public life. The image of the flapper, women with short hair, new fashion, and greater independence, became a cultural symbol of the decade. By the close of the 1920s, the world felt transformed, faster, louder, and more connected. But beneath the glamour and energy of the Roaring Twenties, authoritarian regimes, global economic fragility, and social unrest were building towards even greater upheavals in the decade ahead. The 1930s were defined by crisis and the rise of authoritarian regimes. The decade began with the world reeling from the Great Depression, which had started after the 1929 Wall Street crash. Banks collapsed, businesses shut down, and unemployment soared. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded with the New Deal, a series of government programs aimed at stabilizing the economy, creating jobs, and reforming finance. But while America tried to recover, Europe moved in a darker direction. In Germany, the economic collapse and anger over the Treaty of Versailles created the perfect opening for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. By 1933, Hitler had been appointed chancellor, and within months, he consolidated power into a dictatorship. The Nazis promoted extreme nationalism, racial ideology, and expansionist aims, while crushing opposition and controlling media and education. Italy under Mussolini had already been a fascist state since the 1920s, and in Spain, civil war broke out in 1936. The conflict saw General Francisco Franco's fascist forces, backed by Hitler and Mussolini, fighting against the left-wing Republican side, which was supported by volunteers from around the world and aid from the Soviet Union. Franco's eventual victory in 1939 established another long-lasting dictatorship in Europe. Beyond Europe, tensions were rising in Asia. Japan, which had industrialized quickly and sought empire, invaded Manchuria in 1931 and later launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. Events like the Nanjing Massacre, where Japanese troops killed and brutalized civilians, shocked the world but went largely unanswered. At the same time, international efforts to keep peace were failing. The League of Nations condemned aggression but lacked the power to act. Economic hardship and weak responses from Britain and France only encouraged dictators to push further. Culturally, the 1930s were a paradox. Despite the hardship, cinema entered a golden age with films like Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. Radio became a unifying source of news and entertainment. In science, breakthroughs continued with advances in nuclear physics and discoveries that would later lead to the atomic age. By the end of the 1930s, the direction was clear. Hitler had reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and seized parts of Czechoslovakia. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain and France declared war. The world had been through depression and dictatorship, and now it was once again plunging into global conflict. The 1940s were dominated by the most destructive conflict in history, World War II. The war had begun in 1939 when Germany invaded Poland, but it quickly escalated. By 1940, Germany had overrun much of Western Europe, defeating France in just 6 weeks. Britain, under Winston Churchill, stood alone against Nazi Germany, surviving the relentless bombing campaign known as the Blitz. In 1941, the war expanded dramatically. Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, launching the largest military campaign ever seen. That same year, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, bringing the United States into the war. Suddenly, the conflict spanned Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, a true world war. The fighting was brutal. The Holocaust, carried out by Nazi Germany, murdered 6 million Jews along with millions of others, including Romani people, disabled individuals, and political prisoners. In the Soviet Union, battles like Stalingrad turned the tide against Hitler. In the Pacific, the U.S. began island hopping, seizing territory from Japan after victories at Midway and Guadalcanal. By 1944, the Allies launched D-Day, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. A year later, Germany was defeated, Hitler was dead, and Europe lay in ruins. But the war ended differently in Asia. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, forcing Japan's surrender and marking the dawn of the nuclear age. The cost was staggering: an estimated 70 to 85 million people dead, entire cities destroyed, and millions displaced. But the aftermath also reshaped the global order. The United Nations was founded in 1945 to prevent future conflicts. Europe was divided into Western democracies and Soviet-controlled states, beginning the Cold War. In Asia, independence movements surged, with countries like India pushing harder for freedom from colonial rule. The US emerged as a superpower, its economy booming, while the Soviet Union rose as its rival. Together, they would dominate global politics for decades to come. Even amid destruction, culture carried on. Jazz and swing music defined the wartime sound, while cinema and radio boosted morale. Science, meanwhile, had been transformed by the war. Radar, jet engines, computers, and nuclear weapons all came out of the 1940s. By the end of the decade, the world was exhausted, but also transformed. The 1940s had ended the old empires, unleashed new technologies, and set the stage for a long, tense Cold War. The 1950s were the first full decade of the Cold War. World War II had ended, but the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union shaped almost everything. Both sides built nuclear weapons, competed for influence around the world, and promoted their opposing ideologies: capitalism and democracy on one side, communism and one-party rule on the other. One of the first flashpoints was Korea. In 1950, North Korea, backed by the Soviets and China, invaded South Korea. The United States and other UN forces intervened, pushing the North back, only for China to counterattack. After years of bloody fighting, the Korean War ended in 1953 with the peninsula still divided, a situation that continues today. At home, the Cold War also played out politically. In the US, fears of communism fueled McCarthyism, where suspected communists were blacklisted, investigated, and often ruined without evidence. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin's final years were marked by repression. But after his death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev rose to power, beginning a slightly less repressive era known as de-Stalinization. The decade also saw decolonization gain momentum. Countries across Asia and Africa demanded independence from European empires. India had already become free in 1947, and during the 1950s, nations like Ghana and Indonesia followed. The old colonial order was collapsing. Economically, the US and much of Western Europe experienced growth. Consumer culture exploded. Televisions entered living rooms, cars became symbols of status, and suburbs spread. Rock and roll music, led by figures like Elvis Presley, defined youth culture. In Britain, rationing finally ended after the war, and the Festival of Britain in 1951 symbolized a new optimism. Meanwhile, technology and science advanced quickly. The Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite. This shocked the US and kicked off the space race, a major front in Cold War competition. Nuclear energy also began to spread, both as a power source and a weapon. But tensions were never far away. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956, a popular uprising against Soviet control, was crushed by Soviet tanks. The Suez Crisis that same year showed Britain and France's waning influence when the US and USSR forced them to back down over Egypt's control of the Suez Canal. By the end of the 1950s, the Cold War was firmly set. New nations were emerging from colonial rule, and the space age had begun. It was a decade of both optimism and unease, as the shadow of nuclear weapons hung over a rapidly changing world. The 1960s were one of the most turbulent and transformative decades of the 20th century. The Cold War was still the backdrop, but this was also a time of social change, cultural revolution, and decolonization on a massive scale. In global politics, the Cold War reached new heights. The most dangerous moment came in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US. For 13 tense days, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war before Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for US assurances and a secret deal over American missiles in Turkey. Earlier in 1961, the Berlin Wall had gone up, physically dividing East and West Berlin and symbolizing the divide between the communist and capitalist worlds. The US became heavily involved in Vietnam during the 1960s. What began as support for South Vietnam against communist North Vietnam escalated into full military intervention under President Lyndon B. Johnson. The war became deeply unpopular, sparking mass protests across the US and beyond. At the same time, decolonization accelerated. Across Africa, dozens of nations won independence from European powers, including Nigeria, Kenya, and the Congo. In Asia, former colonies like Malaysia and Singapore also gained sovereignty. The old empires were collapsing for good. In the United States, the decade was defined not just by foreign policy, but also by the civil rights movement. Figures like Martin Luther King Jr. led campaigns against segregation and racial injustice, achieving major victories such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Culture changed dramatically too. The 1960s saw the rise of youth counterculture with music at its core. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, and Jimi Hendrix defined a generation. The hippie movement promoted peace, love, and opposition to the Vietnam War. Protests and demonstrations became a global phenomenon. From Paris in 1968 to campuses across the US, science and technology also leapt forward. In 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. 8 years later, in 1969, the US achieved the ultimate milestone. Apollo 11 landed on the moon, with Neil Armstrong taking one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. By the end of the 1960s, the world had changed dramatically. Old empires were gone, new nations had emerged, and a cultural revolution had redefined what freedom, equality, and progress could mean. But the tensions of the Cold War in Vietnam showed that the struggle for stability was far from over. The 1970s were a decade of uncertainty. marked by economic troubles, political scandals, and continuing Cold War tensions. The optimism of the 1960s gave way to a more unsettled world. The Vietnam War dominated the early years. Despite huge U.S. military involvement, the war dragged on with no clear victory. Mounting casualties and televised images of destruction turned public opinion against it. In 1973, U.S. forces finally withdrew after the Paris Peace Accords, but 2 years later, North Vietnam captured Saigon, unifying the country under communism. In the United States, politics were shaken by the Watergate scandal. After a break-in at the Democratic Party headquarters in 1972, investigations revealed that President Richard Nixon's administration had been involved in illegal activities and cover-ups. Under threat of impeachment, Nixon resigned in 1974, the first U.S. president to do so. Globally, the Cold War saw moments of both confrontation and easing. Relations between the U.S. and Soviet Union entered a period of détente, meaning reduced tensions, with agreements like the Salt-I Treaty to limit nuclear weapons. But conflicts still flared. In the Middle East, the Yom Kippur War of 1973 pitted Israel against Egypt and Syria, and the oil embargo that followed sent energy prices soaring, triggering a global economic crisis. Economically, the 1970s were tough. The combination of high inflation and stagnant growth, known as stagflation, hit many Western countries. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 made things worse, causing fuel shortages and long lines at petrol stations. In Asia, new shifts were underway. In 1972, U.S. President Nixon visited China, opening diplomatic relations with Mao Zedong's communist government, a huge step in reshaping global politics. Meanwhile, wars in Cambodia and Afghanistan destabilized regions further. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in 1979, beginning a long and costly conflict. Culturally, the 1970s were vibrant despite the gloom. Disco music, punk rock, and artists like David Bowie, ABBA, and the Sex Pistols defined the era. Hollywood entered a new golden age with films like Star Wars, The Godfather, and Jaws. Technology advanced too. The first personal computers appeared, and video games like Pong hit the market. By the end of the decade, the world felt unstable. Economic crises, political upheaval, and Cold War conflicts made the 1970s a decade of transition, one that set the stage for the struggles of the 1980s. The 1980s were a decade of big shifts, politically, economically, and culturally. The Cold War still loomed large, but by the end of the decade, it would collapse in ways few expected. In the United States, Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980. His policies, known as Reaganomics, pushed tax cuts, deregulation, and a strong anti-communist stance. Reagan dramatically increased defense spending, including plans for the Star Wars missile defense system, putting heavy pressure on the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, under Mikhail Gorbachev from 1985, faced deep problems. Its economy was stagnating, and Gorbachev introduced reforms. Glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. These changes loosened censorship and aimed to modernize the economy, but they also exposed corruption and allowed criticism of the system to grow. Conflicts continued around the world. In Afghanistan, the Soviet war dragged on, draining resources and morale. In 1989, Soviet troops finally withdrew after nearly a decade of fighting against US-backed Afghan rebels. In Eastern Europe, opposition to communist regimes spread, with movements in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia gaining strength. The Cold War also flared in other regions. The US supported anti-communist groups in Latin America and Africa, while tensions rose over issues like nuclear weapons in Europe. Yet diplomacy also made breakthroughs. In 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear missiles. The decade's climax came in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell. What started as protests in Eastern Europe quickly snowballed. Communist governments collapsed one after another, and East Germans crossed freely into West Berlin for the first time in decades. The Cold War was ending. Economically, the 1980s were uneven. Western nations like the US and Britain under Margaret Thatcher pushed free market policies, weakening unions and privatizing industries. Japan, meanwhile, experienced a booming economy, becoming a global tech and manufacturing powerhouse. Culturally, the 1980s exploded with new styles. MTV launched in 1981, creating the era of the music video. Pop icons like Michael Jackson, Madonna, and Prince dominated global music. Technology began transforming daily life. Personal computers spread, video games like Nintendo became mainstream, and mobile phones appeared for the first time. By the end of the 1980s, the world looked completely different. The Cold War's division of East and West was collapsing, new technologies were reshaping society, and a new global order was about to take shape in the 1990s. The 1990s were a decade of transition. The Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the world entered what felt like a new era of globalization, technology, and U.S. dominance. In Europe, the collapse of the USSR reshaped the continent. Former Soviet states like Ukraine, the Baltic countries, and many Eastern European nations gained independence. Germany was reunified in 1990, with Berlin once again the capital of a united country. The European Union took shape with the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, laying the groundwork for closer economic and political integration, including the creation of the euro currency. The US emerged as the sole superpower. Its military strength was demonstrated in the Gulf War of 1991, when a US-led coalition pushed Iraq out of Kuwait after Saddam Hussein's invasion. The conflict showed how quickly American-led forces could act on the global stage. But not all was stability. The breakup of Yugoslavia led to brutal wars in the Balkans, including ethnic cleansing and the Bosnian War. In 1994, the world was shocked by the Rwandan genocide, where nearly 1 million people were killed in just a few months. These crises showed that the post-Cold War world was not free from violence. At the same time, the 1990s were defined by rapid technological change. The internet moved from a tool of governments and universities into homes and businesses. Companies like Microsoft, Apple, and later Google began transforming daily life. Mobile phones became more common, and email began to replace letters. The dot-com boom saw tech companies soar, changing the economy. Culturally, the 1990s had its own identity. Grunge music, led by Nirvana, and hip-hop with artists like Tupac and Notorious B.I.G., defined youth culture. Television shows like Friends and The Simpsons became global phenomena. Sports also had iconic moments, from the 1998 World Cup in France to the rise of stars like Michael Jordan. By the end of the 1990s, optimism about a new millennium was high. The Cold War was over, the internet was changing everything, and many believed the world was entering an age of peace and prosperity. But the decade also left behind unresolved tensions in the Middle East, in ethnic conflicts, and in the fragility of the new global economy, setting the stage for the challenges of the 21st century.